Okay, memory, it's the sum of who we are, right? It's the bridge to our past and our future. It takes a fleeting moment in our experience and allows it to last indefinitely. It stretches our consciousness over a lifetime and allows us to enjoy meaningful and fulfilling lives. It enables us to project ourselves into the future, imagining what is yet to come. It chronicles the history of our species and will tell our tale long after we're gone. Simply put, without memory, humanity could not exist. Yet, for something so essential and ubiquitous, we still know very little about how it works. Our speaker, director of the UC Irvine Center for Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, has dedicated his life and career to uncovering memory's mysteries, understanding how memories are created and how they are disrupted, and how they can be made to last forever. So let's have a truly unforgettable welcome for Dr. Michael Yassa.
Thank you, buddy. And thank you all for joining this morning, and thank you for inviting me. Would it be possible to share my screen at this time?
Yeah, you should have the ability to do that.
Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
And you can see if I advance the slides, correct?
Yes.
Terrific. Okay, well, as Buddy mentioned, I have the great fortune of being a director of a world-renowned center at the University of California, Irvine, that's been around since 1983. It is actually the first center of its kind in the world. And UC Irvine also is full of firsts in terms of brain science, which is the area of research that I'm in. We have also the honor of being able to say that we are the very first neuroscience department in the world in 1964. One may not think that when it comes to UC Irvine, you might think, well, it may be Harvard or Stanford or any of the such other place, but actually this was the birth of neuroscience or the science of the brain in 1964. So it's a privilege and an honor to be able to speak to you today about some of the work that's been going on in the area of learning and memory. And I've chosen not just to focus on my work in particular, but to give you a little bit of a tour of memory research and the kinds of things that we know to be true of memory. So we'll start with something very similar to what Buddy said. Memory is really the sum of who we are. It's your intellect, your talents, your skills, your habits, your history. Basically everything that makes you who you are, makes you an individual, is about your experiences and your memories. So it is the basis for our individuality. And I want you to think with me here for a second, what would happen if we were to lose this ability? So you wake up one day and you've now lost the ability to make and store any new memories. You might think this is a bizarre situation, but in fact, we know this to be true in some rare cases, and I want to share one of them with you. This is Clive Waring, who some of you might recognize. He's a renowned music conductor in the UK, a very proficient musician. And he was struck with a virus that within just a matter of a short few days robbed him of his ability to make new memories. And his story has been written about quite a bit. He's pictured here with his wife, Deborah, who's written a beautiful book about this. He's also been nicknamed the 7-second man, particularly because that's sort of the span of his memory. So if you start a conversation with him, he might be able to pick it up and carry on for a few seconds. But if you take a pause and he gets distracted, completely forgets that he's had that conversation, and he might be tempted to repeat it. And this has been the narrative of his life for quite a number of years now. He talks about it as the experience of constantly feeling like he's waking up from a dream. You can imagine how devastating this effect is on an individual. And this was not a clinical case study. This was just a story that was written about Clive because he didn't participate in clinical research. But I'll share with you an actual clinical study a little bit later that is very similar to this, just to get a feel for the kinds of things that memory is critical for. But let's talk in detail about how things get into memory in the first place. Now, this is a model that psychologists love. It's called a box and arrow diagram. It allows you to kind of have a simplistic view of the world and put everything in boxes and put arrows between them, suggesting that we actually know what's going on. Now, in reality, there's much more complexity, but this is just a simplified view. It might look complex now, but we're actually going to take this figure and dissect it piece by piece, and we're going to demonstrate and practice together. And I'll need maybe the host's efforts in muting and unmuting folks in mass, because this is going to be quite interactive. Starting with environmental input, when we have things that are out in the periphery, things that might fall onto our eyes, ears, things that we're exposed to, these experiences get encoded very quickly into our sensory memory. And sensory memory is fleeting, it's very rapid, and it's also limited in its capacity. And we're going to demonstrate it in just a couple of seconds, but once we've gone through the entire model. Now, not everything in the environment that falls onto your eyes or onto your ears or things that you smell is going to be encoded with full precision into the brain. You really have to pay attention to those things. So attention is this gating mechanism that allows you to focus on certain elements of what's going on around you to say, that's important, that's salient, I need to encode that better. And attention can work in a variety of different ways. You can purposefully devote your attention, as I hope you're doing right now, but you can also have your attention be captured by something. So for example, if you're driving and you're paying attention to driving, but a little child jumps in front of the vehicle, that's going to immediately capture your attention, and you're going to react to that very quickly. So this notion that attention can be both purposeful and unintentionally captured by something out in the environment is very important, because it's the combination of those two things that guide what ends up getting stored by the brain. Then we talk about the first stage of storage, or the first stage of memory, that's short-term memory. Now, short-term memory is quite short. We also talk about it as working memory. It's holding on to information just for a short, few seconds. A good example of this is if you're traveling and somebody gives you a call and you pick up the phone and they say, hey, guess what? I just found Mark's number. You got to give him a call. Can you write it down? And you say, well, I don't have a pen and paper with me right now, but why don't you just give me the number and I'll rehearse it and I'll be able to dial it once I hang up with you. So then he gives you the number, and what do? Well, you say the number over and over to yourself a few times until it's time to dial that number. But once you've dialed that number, what happens to that number in your memory? Poof, it's gone, right? Because there's no reason to remember it anymore. And I'm sure many of you have had this experience. Once you stop rehearsing it, it really doesn't need to be there anymore. So that's short-term memory. It's purposeful. It is just for a short period of time while it's useful, but then once it's gone, it's forgotten. However, if I were to come back the next day and ask you about that phone number, so now I'm asking about your long-term memory. If I ask you about Mark's number, you'll probably say, I have no idea what Mark's number is. I got to check my phone. But if I give you a choice of two numbers and say, I know it's one of those two, do you think you'd be able to figure out which one it is? Probably. In fact, about 85% of the time, you'll be spot on. And that tells us that even though this memory was intended to be a short-term memory, some amount of it got into your long-term memory because of this rehearsal process. And the next day, you were able to retrieve some components of it. Now, not everything that we store in our long-term memory needs to be so actively rehearsed. It turns out that actually rehearsal can happen quite unintentionally while you sleep at night. Your brain replays through these memories, sifts and filters through the needless ones, and holds on to the important ones so that you can store them for later. Okay, that was a very quick run through this model. Now we're going to focus on each box and demonstrate it together. Let's start with sensory memory. How do we study sensory memory? Well, this was studied quite a while ago. Carl Jevons was the very first person to really try to estimate the capacity of your long-term memory. And he did it by trying to estimate the number of dots. Actually, he did it with throwing a bunch of black beans on a white tablecloth, but we don't have black beans on a white tablecloth right now. I have a computer screen and I can project little arrays of black dots. So this is an active participation component. So maybe we can unmute everyone, because I'm going to ask you to say out loud to me the number of dots that you see on the screen once you can identify it. Now keep in mind, each little box with black dots in it is only going to appear for 200 milliseconds. You might think that's outrageous, but believe me, you'll be able to do this just fine. Are we ready? All right, here we go. I'm going to do several of these. They're going to show up in little squares with a bunch of black dots. I just want you to yell out the number of dots that you see. Here we go.
4,
9,
5,
4,
Okay. All right, how about this one?
7,
7,
7,
6,
Okay. How about this one?
5,
6,
All right, how about this one?
6,
6,
And this one?
5,
6,
And one last one.
4,
5.
Okay. All right, so here's the interesting thing that happened.
They're all the same.
If there were 5 or 4 dots, you guys were pretty much spot on, minus a couple. But if the number exceeded that, we started to get answers all over the place, anywhere from 4 to 7. And that's exactly what Jevons found. He found that at a number 5 or less, if there were less than 5 items to be stored in any given time, his accuracy was almost perfect. But once the number started to increase, his span started to suffer, and he really could not capture it with good accuracy. So you guys replicated his result directly. Now, the question I have for you is, how do you think you did this? Maybe somebody can volunteer and give me a walkthrough. What did you feel like you were doing?
Looking at the dots.
And did you feel like the dots were only there for 200 milliseconds?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And
It seemed
what
like we were
about-
recognizing patterns.
I was
pattern.
recognizing patterns and counting afterwards.
And recognizing, thank you. Perfect. Recognizing pattern. All right. So now we can mute everyone again. Thank you so much. Recognizing patterns, that's the answer I was looking for. Recognizing patterns and counting afterwards. What you were doing is actually using your sensory memory, which allowed that array of dots to persist in your mind's eye for a couple of additional 100 milliseconds, so you can actually count and create a pattern. So this ability of something that is only shown for 200 milliseconds to persist a little bit longer in your mind's eye is exactly what sensory memory is. And the same thing happens with auditory information that comes in through your ears, and it's the reason why you hear sound or me talking as a continuous experience rather than a series of disjuncted sounds. Everything is a continuous experience. This kind of memory leads to our continuous conscious experience of the world around us. Everything is threaded together, one moment to the next, because every moment persists just a little bit longer. Okay, so now let's say we pay attention, we get things into the next stage of storage. What is that about? Oh, I forgot to tell you one thing. Where is this memory stored? It turns out that sensory memory like this is actually kind of stored everywhere, because it depends on the sensory modality. In other words, if it's visual information that's coming in through your eyes, it's going to be stored in the visual bits of the brain, which happens to be in the back of the brain. You see the green parts that say visual cortex, occipital lobe. Those are the parts of the brain that are involved in processing vision, and they're going to be the parts of the brain that are critical for sensory visual memory. Same thing with auditory information. You'll see this piece that is yellow surrounded by orange. That's called auditory cortex. That is where auditory information is going to be stored, and so on and so on. So this kind of memory is landlocked to the regions that process that kind of information. Okay, now let's go on and talk about the next type of memory, which is short-term memory, also known as working memory. And this is a picture of Alan Baddeley, who's done quite a bit of work on this. He's one of the most renowned characters in the world of memory research. And he has identified several aspects of working memory that are important to note. capacity is small. So you can imagine, if that phone number that you have to give to somebody while you're on a call with them is 18 digits, they're going to have trouble remembering it. So we do have a capacity to the kinds of things we can put in our working memory. It does require active maintenance of information, and it's really spanning relatively short delays. It's seconds and not minutes. And we believe that it's a separate process from sensory memory or long-term memory. And when I say a separate process, what I really mean is that there's data in the field to suggest that certain impairments in parts of the brain will selectively compromise that type of memory and not the other types of memory. So things seem to be a little bit more compartmentalized. Now, Alan Baddeley also hypothesized that in addition to the visuospatial sketchpad, which is the visual working memory, and the phonological loop, which is the auditory or the hearing working memory, there's this thing that sits on top called the central executive, the CEO of it all. And he suspected, and now there's a lot of data to suggest, that it's actually our big frontal lobes that serve as that central executive. The frontal lobe has many functions, but one of the key functions is working memory and being able to attract or move attention towards working memory. Okay, now we're going to do another little demo. Here's the way this is going to work. We're going to estimate our working memory capacity. Now, it would help if you have a piece of paper and a pen close by. I don't want you to use it just yet. I'm going to show you letters on the screen one at a time. I want you to just focus on the screen and try to learn that sequence of letters. Once the sequence is done, I'm going to say go, and I want you to write it down to the best of your ability, and we'll see how many you can recall. Sound good? All right, if everyone is ready, we're going to get started now. Go. You know, it's challenging.
I only got 4.
Give you guys another second or so.
After about the first 4, I'm lost.
I'm surprised I didn't hear groans and, you know, all sorts of angry remarks.
We're muted.
Good point. Keep everybody proper by mute. All right, so here's the sequence. First of all, did everybody get them all?
No.
Okay, great. Then
They
you're
did
all
it
normal.
live.
That's fantastic. Because if you'd gotten them all, I would have said, give me a call later. We'd like to study your brain. And that's supposed to get them all. But let me ask you, how many of you got the first 3?
I did.
Yeah, a number of you. Okay, what about the last 3?
No.
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 Sounds like a couple of people got the last couple. What about the middle?
Middle, definitely middle.
Yep, got the.
Okay, a couple of you got that one as well. Well, here's the scoop. So if you look at the data on this, what's interesting is you guys demonstrated one of 2 effects. You demonstrated what's known as the primacy effect, which means that for working memory, and actually for every other kind of memory, the first few items of any list of things you learn are going to have a privileged status in your brain. You're going to remember those preferentially. Now, you may anecdotally already know this. The firsts of anything are really important. Comedians know this. You got to start very strong. Book authors know this. You have to have a strong intro. Anyone who puts together, you know, big Hollywood blockbuster movies, think of a James Bond movie, you start right in the middle of the action. The beginnings are really, really important because they stick. Now, the middles and the ends are a little bit more fickle. In reality, there is also a recency effect that allows you to preferentially remember the last few items. However, this experiment shows, this is from 1965, Postman and Phillips showed that if you distract participants in the study they actually will fail to achieve the recency effect. And how they distracted people here was just simply give them 30 seconds where they have to count backwards. So if they did that, they were unable to have this recency effect. Now for you guys, you did not express the recency effect as well, but it also turns out to be the case that whenever we test in a group setting, especially over Zoom, we found out people get distracted very easily, especially by other people's responses. And, you know, some of the, oh, wait a minute, I thought this thing was only going to be 4 or 5 items. This is way too many. That ends up being a sufficient distraction. So in general, the primacy effect is one to really remember. The recency effect is occasional. If you don't get distracted, you can achieve it, but in general, it's difficult to get that to come through. Now I want to try another demo just like the last one. It's just a different sequence. Okay, so same exact story. Again, let's unmute everybody. And this time, I want you to just keep track of the letters. And we're going to do the same exact thing one more time. It's just a different letter string. Okay, here we go.
C.
Oh, you don't have to read it out loud. Keep track.
I kind of know this one.
Yeah.
I sure hope so. So write it down. No, I'm kidding. You don't have to write it down. Something different happened this time. Obviously, this is a much easier letter string. Now, why is that? I gave you an unfair advantage here. I allowed you to form words instead of just a random string of letters. And maybe you tried that with the initial string, but I would say probably not so successfully. Certainly not as successfully as here. What I allowed you to do is something called chunking. Believe it or not, that is the technical term, chunking. Instead of encoding that entire string of letters, what you encoded was 2 chunks. And those 2 chunks essentially hold 2 places in your working memory, as opposed to each one of the letters holding its own place in your working memory. Okay, so let's mute one more time and come back to how do we think about this in terms of capacity. So let's say we are able to encode these chunks. And in reality, our chunking scheme could be a little more efficient. So maybe it's not just words, maybe it's phrases, maybe it's whole sentences if you're that good. But nevertheless, what is that capacity limitation? And the answer to this came in an interesting form from George Miller. George Miller hypothesized that that magical number is 7. And 7 is an interesting number. There's a lot of lore around the number 7. And he kind of, fell for the same thing, I believe. He suggested that the limit on information processing is 7. But he added a little caveat and said it's plus or minus 2. So anywhere really between 5 and 9, there's individual variability, depends on the situation, but really it's around 7. It turns out that his testing techniques were quite unique. And when you start to look at the aggregate data across many, many laboratories around the world, turns out the limit actually is closer to 3 or 4. Now that seems almost too much or too little for us to be able to store. 3 or 4, it seems like we can do a lot more than that. But remember, it's not 3 or 4 items. It's 3 or 4 chunks. So really, this is a way for us to be able to cheat the system. The size of what we can store is quite variable depending on the effectiveness of our chunking scheme. Okay, where is this working memory stored? I alluded to it a little bit by talking about Alan Baddeley's work, but it is the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are most evolved in humans, as you all know. They're involved in planning, decision-making, executive function. They are critical for working memory, meaning that if you were to damage the frontal lobe, there will be serious problems in working memory. And they're also critical for problem solving. Some of you may know this already, but frontal lobe syndrome involves deficits in all of these areas, also involves changes in personality, changes in the way that you can inhibit some of the impulses that we might have. But that's really the purview of the frontal lobe. Now going on to long-term memory, this one is a simple test. We don't need to unmute just yet, but we will in a second. I'm going to show you pictures on the screen, and I just want you to look at the screen. That's all I want you to do. Here we go. Okay, I showed you 4 pictures. I could have, in reality, shown you many, many more if we're doing an actual long-term memory test in the laboratory. This will be hundreds of pictures, but we don't have all the time in the world. So I'm just showing you 4 pictures for today, and I'm just talking for a few seconds to make sure that I distract you enough to get this out of your working memory span and to get it into your long-term memory. So now when I test you, you're actually going to use your long-term memory. Now I'm going to show you pairs of pictures on the screen, and I want you all together to say left or right which one you saw before.
Left.
Left.
Beautiful. How about this pair?
Right.
Right.
Terrific. How about this one?
Right.
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 Uh-huh. And one last one.
Left.
Left.
Excellent. Well, this is 100% performance. So you guys can write home about this and say that I took a memory test with Dr. Yassa today, and my memory is 100%. But I want to give you a little more credit than that. These were 4 pictures. How many do you think we could have learned together today?
Many.
Throw out a number.
100.
100.
78.
78. Oh, I like that.
7
Anybody
plus or
care to
minus
go above
2.
100? 100 is our max right now.
No,
Eight.
What about the 7? The 7.
14.3.
I love the specificity of some of these guys.
500.
7.
Okay, now we're getting a little higher. Well, 7 was for working memory, but now we're testing long-term memory. I'd like to think that you guys can do a little bit more.
Check this out.
You've got 500 is your highest guess right now, and I would be willing to bet that if I were to say I could probably teach you 10,000 of these images, you would say I'm nutty. He thinks we can do 10,000. Maybe we can do 10,000. That's exactly what Lionel Standing showed in 1973. 10,000 images, 88% accuracy. With pictures just like the ones I showed you. If it's words or black and white pictures, you know, accuracy goes down a little bit, but 88% for vivid pictures at 10,000 images. Now, 10,000 is not a magical number. It's a proxy. In reality, it's a proxy for another big number that we call infinity. In other words, as far as we're concerned, there does not seem to be a capacity limitation on our long-term memory. And you think about it. Think about that for a second. We're talking about the thing that you store all of your life's experiences in, your long-term memory. Every name, every face, every experience, every image that you've had in your entire life. There is no capacity limitation that we know of there. The brain is wired with enough connections, enough synapses to be able to store what you can build up in 1,000 lifetimes. So we're not going to run into a capacity limitation there, but this is just a way to illustrate how powerful that form of memory is. Now that said, it is pretty darn good, but it's not perfect. Can anybody tell me, maybe we can unmute one more time, which one of these you saw before?
Right.
Right.
No, I can't tell.
Not left.
I saw a zebra.
The longer we keep this going, the more flip-flopping we will hear. So it turns out it's actually the one on the left, but hey, this is a really challenging task. You had no idea that I would show you a zebra and then later on test you with 2 zebras. That's just unfair. And in reality, that's not what memory is geared for. Memory is not keeping a perfect replica of the reality around us. It's keeping an abstract representation. It's keeping a gist or a compressed version of the reality around us that's sufficient to say, hey, did we see a zebra? Sure we did. But which of the zebras is it? That's a little more challenging, right? So it's not a perfect device because it's not intended to be that. It has not evolved to be a perfect device. It has evolved to allow you to keep just enough of what you experience in your brain to guide future decision making. That's the entire point of memory. As much as I hate to say it, it's not there for us to reminisce. It's not there for us to tell fun stories, although that's a great side effect of it. It is there for us to learn from our mistakes, to learn to promote our own survival down the line. How could we do that without having a record of what we did wrong and what we did right in the past? That's the evolutionary purpose of memory. Okay, so it's not perfect. So now let's talk about where this memory is stored. And this is a complex figure. We're not going to go through it in detail, but just to give you an idea of how many different memory systems are in the brain, we're going to focus just on one system, this declarative or explicit memory system that allows you to store memories of facts and events, things that happen to you and things that you know. And there's one place in the brain in particular that's really important for that. You may have heard about it before. It is this thing called the hippocampus. And it is called that because if you were to section it out of the brain, much like what you see here in this slice, and pull it out in its entirety, it has this resemblance to a seahorse. And that's where the name comes from. Now, this part of the brain is nestled deep inside the cortex, covered up by the rest of the brain, protected essentially from trauma, from anything else, and is critical for storing long-term memories. How do we know so? Well, again, we go back to cases of amnesia. These are two individuals that have a remarkable history in neuroscience. On the left is Henry Molaison, who we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. He was one of these clinical cases, just like Clive Waring, who lost his memory because he lost his hippocampus. Pictured on the right is Brenda Milner, who at the time that she tested him, this was 1957 when they first met and they started testing. Dr. Milner has had her 102nd birthday this year. So she is still with us, she is still active, and she's a wonderful researcher, and she has really pioneered the field of memory research by understanding much about Henry's brain and how it functions. So what was Henry's story? What happened to him? Well, as a young man, he had a biking accident. He fell and he hit his head. And from that moment onwards, he started to suffer from epileptic seizures. Well, as many of you know, seizure disorder can be quite devastating, but in most cases, it can be kept at bay with pharmaceuticals, with anti-epileptics. In his case, his epilepsy was pharmacologically intractable, meaning it did not respond to anti-epileptic medication. What to do in that case? Well, the same thing in 1957 is what we would do today. It's a surgical procedure. His surgical procedure was performed by William Scoville, a neurosurgeon, who bilaterally, meaning on both sides of the brain, removed the hippocampus and the surrounding regions because that's where the epilepsy was coming from. Now, at the time, Scoville had no idea what the hippocampus did. And with these neurosurgeries, the idea is the neurosurgeon would go around, the brain doesn't have pain receptors, so you can expose the brain and poke around with an electrode, stimulating different parts of the cortex to see if there's an effect. And normally what you do is you make sure that the person can still move their fingers, can still talk, can still carry out their bodily functions. And if they can, then you can say, well, maybe I can take out that part of the brain and cause minimal damage. That's what happened with the hippocampus. He poked around there, and Henry, can you move your fingers? Sure, I can move my fingers. Henry, can you still talk? Sure, I can talk. Can you understand what I'm saying? Sure, I can understand what you're saying. So Scoville thought to himself, well, that seems like an unnecessary part of the brain. I'm just going to take it out because that's where the seizures are coming from. Again, not having any idea what this part of the brain does. After the surgery, things got really interesting. Scoville would walk into Henry's room and say, Henry, everything went well with the surgery. You're going to be recovering in no time. And Henry says, gee, doc, I appreciate it, but I'm just a little hazy on the details. I'm not sure really what's happened here. And he says, well, that's just, the effect of some of the sedation that we gave you earlier. You'll be fine. Walks out of the room, walks back 5 minutes later, says, Henry, we've got some paperwork for you to sign. And Henry says, I'm sorry, who are you? I've never met you before. And he could have done that 100 or 1,000 times walking back into Henry's room. And for Henry, every time would have been the very first time that he's meeting Scoville. Because from the point of the surgery onwards, he was unable to make any new memories of anything that happens to him. Things would happen and he would engage, but then a few seconds later, it's gone, as if the brain has no trace of it. This was so intriguing for Scoville that he called a colleague of his by the name of Wilder Penfield. And Penfield, who was also a brilliant neurosurgeon, had somebody working with him, at the time training with him, by the name of Brenda Milner, a neuropsychologist, very early in her career. So he decided, I'm going to send Dr. Milner down with some tests, paper and pencil tests, to be able to assess Henry fully and see what's going on. And that's exactly what happened. She came down to test him in 1957. She found that he was profoundly impaired in his ability to learn new facts and events. Nothing can get through to Henry. And he had no memory of the recent past either. Things leading up to the surgery were gone. But he still remembered who he was. His remote past was intact. So the notion of what we term Hollywood amnesia was not the case here. He did not forget who he was or where he grew up. All of that was still intact. He just could not remember things leading up to the surgery and could not make any new memories from the point of the surgery onwards. This was most intriguing. One of the other things that was really interesting about Henry is that his ability to have language, have good IQ, have working memory, that short phone number memory span, learn new skills and habits, all of that was okay. So it was this intriguing situation in which a very specific memory ability was lost, everything else seemed to be preserved. Here is one of the tests that she did with him. This is called a Rayo complex figure test. Now, the Rayo complex figure test has two phases. The first phase is what's called visual reproduction, where you just have to copy the figure. That's what you see in all the top panels. You see in an HM, EP is another amnesic, LM is a partial amnesic, and then control is an age and sex matched individual. All of them could visually reproduce this figure, even though it's complex. But then you take it away and come back 20 minutes later and say, do you remember that thing that you drew for me 20 minutes ago? I want you to draw that again on this blank piece of paper from memory. Most of the time, people cuss under their breath. They have no idea we would test them that way. But what you see in the control all the way on the right is that you actually get pretty reasonable performance. Even after a 20-minute delay, most of the details of this figure come back. LM, who's a partial amnesic, brings back a little bit, not too much, but HM and EP, who both had complete hippocampal damage or complete hippocampal ablation, could not bring back anything. The writing here is a little too small, so I'm going to read it to you. Under HM, it says, Ray recall, no recall of even drawing it. So no ability to recall things from 20 minutes ago. Here's another test that Milner did with him. This is called mirror drawing. This is one of my favorite tests. You have a 5-pointed star and you have a border with 2 lines, and your job is to take a pen or a pencil and start at the top and trace the star in between the 2 lines all the way around the 5 points until you get back to the top. Sounds easy, right? Except you're doing it not looking at your actual hand, but looking at a mirror reflection of your hand. You can see the setup on the left. This individual is sitting behind a barrier. He cannot see his hand directly. He can only see its mirror reflection. So everything is mirror reversed. This is a very, very challenging task. Unless you're a dentist or a dental hygienist who's used to working in a mirror, this is not trivial. It takes some time to practice. Now, if you look at performance for the average person at the bottom, on day 1, you might start off with a lot of errors, say 30 errors, but within about 10 trials on the same day, you can reduce your error gradually and become very proficient at this. On day 2, you come back and there's what we call savings, meaning you remember what happened on day 1, and you can also reduce your error. By day 3, you've got this thing down pat, no problem. Now, this could be the performance for an average person, but this actual data you're looking at was Henry's performance. In other words, even though he had no recollection of the experiences that led up to this learning, he could still learn new skills. Every day he would get behind that barrier, grab the pencil and start tracing, and he knew he was pretty good at it, but he had no explanation for why that is. And even when Milner would ask him, Henry, how are you getting so good at this? Have you done this before? He says, nope, I have no idea, and I've never done this before. And I'm seeing now that there's some comments in the chat. Memento is a perfect example. 51st Dates is another example. And Finding Nemo is my third example. You guys completely harped on the 3 beautiful examples that I like to give from Hollywood that are actually relatively accurate, right? So Dory was a great example of that in Finding Nemo and Finding Dory. And 51st Dates, the character of, I'm blanking on her name now.
Drew Barrymore.
Drew Barrymore, thank you. And Memento, it was the first one. Memento is a little disturbing, but it was actually probably the most accurate out of all of them in terms of a depiction of this. So those are movies to look into if you're interested in seeing what this is like in real life. percentage of the population suffering from this is quite low because it really comes as a function of either a very, very specific type of epilepsy, what's called complex partial seizures, and it has to not be addressed pharmacologically, and it has to result in a bilateral temporal lobe resection. Typically, you only remove the hippocampus on one side, not the other, so you have some preservation. So this kind of profound deficit is quite rare these days. So these are rare patient cases. Okay, so he could do well with mirror drawing, meaning that he could still encode and make new skills and new habits, but he could not remember the experiences that made him so proficient at it. So what did Milner conclude? Well, the ability to acquire new long-term memories requires the hippocampus. The hippocampus was not required for short-term or working memory, and was not required for habit and skill memory, and also is not the ultimate storage site for long-term memories because all of the memories of the ancient past were still there. So that means that memories have to funnel in through the hippocampus, but then they become dependent on other parts of the brain. And now we know that they actually get stored in parallel throughout the brain. Okay, so far so good. Let's see if there's another question in the chat here. What's being done now that wasn't done before from a remedial standpoint? Well, first, the anti-epileptic medications have gotten better. So that's an advance. And there's a variety of them with different mechanisms. Second, our surgical procedures have gotten more refined. So typically, instead of removing the entire hippocampus or removing it from both sides of the brain, we can go with sharper precision and remove only a small locus of epileptic seizures and not the whole thing, because we can use brain imaging technology, we can use intracranial EEG technology, for example, to be able to get a very accurate picture of where the seizure locus is. And based on that, we can remove only a small part as opposed to the whole thing. So things have gotten better from that standpoint, but still, surgery, even though the surgical technique is better, surgery is still a very dramatic response to this. Okay, so now let's pivot a little bit and talk about memory's imperfections. This is where I like to invoke the brilliant work of my colleague at UC Irvine, a world pioneer in this area by the name of Elizabeth Loftus. Now, Beth Loftus really was the person who defined this field of false memory, imperfect memory. What was the first thing that she discovered? Well, she discovered that for eyewitness testimony, for example, leading questions can impact the nature of the recollected memory. So here's one example. You have a depiction of the actual accident of two cars colliding. And you have two types of questions. One question could be about how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And another question could be about how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? And the nature of that question impacts the memory reconstruction. What we find is that if you use the word smashed, those who are getting that question will answer about average 40.8 miles per hour. But if they hear the word hit instead, the average answer is 34 miles per hour. And that's not about lying or deceit at all. It is simply about how memory is reconstructive. It is not a static picture of reality. It is a constantly reconstructed and reimagined construction that is modified based on experiences. The classic case was in 1978 called the misinformation paradigm. This is an experiment in which participants come into the laboratory, they're exposed to a video of a car going up to a stop sign and then turning. That's the initial phase. And for about half of the time, there's a misinformation phase where they might hear something like, the car came to a yield sign. That happens subsequently. So first they're exposed to the experience, and then they have the misinformation phase that says the car came to a yield sign. And then during the test phase, which can happen a few minutes later or a few days or weeks later, they're shown two images or two videos, one of them with the car coming up to the stop sign, and the other one they've never seen before of the car coming up to a yield sign. And they're asked, which one did you see before? And here's the interesting thing. If they are not exposed to the misinformation, 75% of the time they'll have the right answer and say the car came to a stop sign. If they're exposed to the misinformation phase, only 40% of the time will they have the right answer, and about 60% of the time they'll say the car came to a yield sign, an experience they have never seen before. Remarkable difference between those two. And again, no lying, no deceit, just how memory works. Here's another one of my favorite experiments where she implanted false memories. She had people come into the laboratory and recall elaborate memories from going to Disneyland during childhood and interacting with the Bugs Bunny character. Now, this may not be the right cohort for this, but if you grew up with Disney like I did, you'd know Bugs Bunny ain't no Disney character. Okay? Bugs Bunny is Warner Brothers, not Disney. In fact, fairly certain if he shows up on Disney territory, he'd be shot on sight. So this is an impossible memory. It could not have happened, not in a million years, and yet 30% of all participants had a very vivid recollection of interacting with Bugs Bunny when visiting Disneyland. An impossible false memory. Here's another one that she surveyed using fake photographs. Now she asked, or the team asked participants to come into the laboratory and bring pictures of their past history, maybe pictures hanging out with their parents, hanging out with their friends, and then they take those pictures and they doctor them. They essentially use fake photographs by putting that picture inside another picture, much like you see here in the hot air balloon, that has never happened before, okay? This is an experience that has never happened. This person has never been in a hot air balloon, but you now show them this picture kind of hidden in between all the other pictures that they're bringing back from their past. And they'll say things like, I'm still pretty certain it occurred when I was in the 6th grade at the local school there. I'm pretty certain that mom is on the ground taking a photo. Again, experience never happened, and yet they have this vivid recollection of it. So clearly memory is not perfect. Clearly it's quite fallible. Why does this happen? Why do we forget? Why are memories so imperfect? And there's a variety of reasons for this. First, encoding could fail. It's possible that information never got in there in the first place, or got in there with low fidelity. We didn't pay perfect attention to it during that time that it was encoded. So it was perceived, but not memorized. Memories could also weaken with time. They could decay. And regardless of what you might do with a memory, the more time that passes, the more likely it's going to decay. So your memory for everything that happened yesterday is very different than memory for several weeks ago. Interference can also happen, and actually that's the thing that Beth Loftus's work really speaks to. Memories can interfere with each other. You can use similar memories that overlap with it to shake off or reconstruct or change those memories. So that can cause forgetting of the existing information or hamper the acquisition of new information. And finally, we have the ability to, or we have the potential to lose access to memories because retrieval cues are not there. So the memories are still there, but we lose that crucial retrieval cue that allows us to access it. We typically think of this as the tip of the tongue phenomenon. You know exactly what it is, but the more and more you think about it, you can't come up with it. And then guess what? If you take some time away from it, it comes right back to you because your brain finally found that right retrieval cue that it was working on in the background. So those are just some of the reasons why we forget. Okay, what about remembering things that persist, that can last a good long time? Oh, let me check the chat real quick. There's, okay, I'm gonna stay away from that one. I'll let you guys discuss that in the aftermath of this talk. So remembering emotional information, by the way, the comment was about political parties, but I'll leave that alone. Remembering emotional information. This is based on the work of another pair of colleagues at UC Irvine, pioneers in this area, Dr. James McGaugh, who's actually the founding director of my center and the founding director of the very first neuroscience department in the world at UC Irvine, and his protege at the time and now a tenured faculty member at UC Irvine, Dr. Larry Cahill. Remembering emotional information. This is an interesting topic for all of us. We know that emotional things that happen to us tend to be stored with higher fidelity. We want to hold on to them for a longer period of time because they're salient, because they're important. So what did they do? They brought people into the laboratory and had them view a series of slides. And these slides had a very interesting attribute to them. They heard one of two narratives while they're watching those slides. Those slides were a series of pictures, some of them a little bit more gruesome than others, but they heard one of two narratives while viewing those slides. The start and the end are the same, the middle is what's different. And it changed the emotional tone. So later on, they tested the memory for the slides, and they focused on the middle section to see what kinds of things people remembered. I'll give you an example of this. I'm not going to read it in detail, but the beginning and the end are the same, but the middle is very different. I'm just going to give you an excerpt from the middle. On the left side, you hear something like, "At the hospital, the staff are preparing for a practice disaster drill, which the boy will watch." On the right side, you hear instead, "At the hospital, the staff prepare the emergency room to which the boy is rushed." So you can imagine one narrative is very innocuous. It doesn't have anything. It has a kind of a reinterpretation of those gruesome pictures as if it's fake blood and makeup and so on. The other one has a really severe injury that this boy was subjected to. So then the question is, which of these stories, which of these narratives leads to better remembering of the slides? And the answer, of course, is what you might predict. The emotional narrative led to a much better remembering of the slides, and in particular, the slides that happened during that emotional component. So you have this built-in control in this experiment. The beginning and the end are the same, only the middle is different, and the middle is where you see different memory. So the upshot is that emotional arousal impacts memory, perhaps making it more persistent. But the interesting thing about this is that there's a circuitry in the brain that is wired for emotion. And we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when this circuitry goes awry. Just like we talked about the hippocampus in the context of memory, the amygdala is really critical for storing emotional information. The amygdala is this structure pictured in red here that sits right in front of the hippocampus and interacts with it quite heavily. In other words, it is able to tell the hippocampus whenever there's something that is strongly emotional to say, "This is important. I need you to store this with higher fidelity. This is crucial for our survival." Now, some of you may be asking this question already. I think I saw it on the chat, whether this is the same thing that happens in PTSD. That's exactly right. What happens in PTSD is this mechanism gets hijacked and goes into overdrive. And we've shown this actually in our laboratory as well.
Hey, Michael, we've got about 8 minutes till the schedule end. How much longer do you think you got? This is fascinating. We can run long.
No, that's okay. I think I probably about have another 5 minutes or so.
Super.
Excellent. All right, so emotions' role is complex. Does it always enhance memory? No. There are situations like the weapon focus, which some of you may be familiar with, where the central emotional detail might be remembered. Details about the gun, for example, about the experience of being held up, but other peripheral details are typically lost. So the look of the assailant, what they were wearing, in some cases even the race of the assailant, all of these things can be quickly forgotten or not even encoded in the first place because of that zoom-in effect of emotion. So this is one reason why eyewitness testimony is highly unreliable. I want to share with you just one interesting case, the case of SM, the curious case of SM. This is a clinical case study, a 44-year-old woman with a rare genetic condition that damaged her amygdala. She became known as fearless. Now, you can imagine that all of us have a lot of variability in terms of the things that make us scared. But in general, snakes, spiders, world's scariest roller coaster, haunted houses, horror movies, and even public speaking, with some exceptions, can be really scary experience. They subjected her to all of these experiences, and she expressed no sense of fear whatsoever. This was bizarre. I'm not going to go through this story in detail, but it's a story that was written about her being held at knife point and she in a park, and she came back the next day to the same park. She escaped, she was fine, and really kind of told the person off and came back to the same park the next day as if nothing happened. it was really incredible for researchers to see this, because fear is a natural and healthy response. And to see someone missing it is not easy to fathom. But what they found is that even though she was fearless, she could still experience panic. And she only experienced it when faced with the possibility of essentially not having enough air or having air hunger. That was still experienced despite the absence of an amygdala, suggesting that there's more than one kind of fear. In this case, she had a panic response when she was breathing carbon dioxide, obviously not something you'd want to do, but that's the only time where she experienced this panic response. So the amygdala, critical for emotion. And now the last part of this talk is the part I think you've all been looking forward to. What about perfect memory? We've talked a lot about how memory is fallible, how it fails, how it has problems, but there are these individuals, extraordinary individuals, who have highly superior autobiographical memory. This was the first one that came to Dr. McGaw, and this was in the early 2000s. And this is an excerpt from an email from her. She says, "I remember every day, everything said to me, every place I went, every book I've read, every face I've seen, everything I've done since I was 13 years old. My memory before 13 is fragmented at best. However, everything afterward seems to be burned into my brain, whether I like it or not, with shockingly true to life clarity." Now, she struggled deeply with this. She came to him because she was trying to figure out how to turn it off. He didn't have the answer to that, could not turn it off. But what it did was spark an area of research into what's called highly superior autobiographical memory, or we term it HSAM. And a number of folks came after Jill Price talking about this, and I want to just show you a couple of them.
Louise Owen is
Are you able
37
to
years
hear the
old
video?
and a professional violinist living in New York City. But she has another gift too, one that is far more rare. Let me give you a date. Let's say January 2nd, 1990.
Right now, I'm remembering the jogging class that I started that morning.
And you're actually back there.
I can feel it. I can remember the coach saying, "Keep going."
That was more than 20 years ago when she was 16, a date I picked completely at random, as I did this one, February 18th, 1988.
1988. Oh,
You're laughing.
I'm laughing. It was a Thursday. I had a big conversation with a friend of mine, and that's all I'm going to say.
Louise says she can remember every day of her life since the age of 11. Try to talk us through, can you do that? How it works out of the air. April 21st, 1991.
1991. Okay, April 21st. So in the moment between April 21st and 1991, I have scrolled through 25 April 21sts, thinking, which one is it going to be? Which one is it going to be? Okay, 1991, which was a Sunday. And I was in Los Angeles, and I had a concert with the American Youth Symphony.
You went to the most important thing
Right,
that happened that
that
day.
was the most, I mean, I really don't want to hear about, sort of the day. Oh, I got up in the morning and I got dressed.
Yeah, you remember that.
Yeah.
You remember what you had for lunch?
Not what I had for lunch that day, but I do remember what I had for dinner the night before.
And effortless. It was just pops
Right.
in.
I mean, for me, it's almost as automatic as if you say, "What is your name and where do you live?"
But how do we know that what she says she remembers really happened? Enter James McGaw, a professor of neurobiology at the University of California, Irvine, and a renowned expert on memory. Dr. McGaw is the first to discover and study superior autobiographical memory, and he is quizzing Louise, his fifth subject, to find out. An eye condition requires him to wear a clouded lens.
Let's move back in time now to 1990. It rained on several days in January and February. Can you name the dates on which it rained?
Believe it or not, she could.
Let's see. It was slightly rainy and cloudy on January 14th, 15th. It was very hot the weekend of the 27th, 28th. No rain.
We checked the official weather records.
It rained very hard on Sunday, February 4th.
And she was right. McGaw says this type of memory is completely new to science, so he and his colleagues have had to devise their own tests, like this one on public events.
October 19th, 1987.
It was a Monday. That was the day of the big stock market crash, and the cellist Jacqueline Dupre died that day.
The Berlin Wall falls on what day?
November 9th, 1989, which was a Thursday.
Christopher Reeve's accident occurred on what day?
It was Saturday, May 27th, 1995.
And when were the Oscars held in 1999?
In 1999, Sunday, March 21st.
Yes, perfect.
So hopefully this gives you an idea of how extreme this kind of recollection, an effortless recollection is. I'm going to actually skip through the next two videos. One of them is Mary Lou Henner. The 60 Minutes piece is available online, and you can check it out another time. But I just want to tell you where we are on this now. This ability does not transfer to other domains of memory they have. It's really only autobiographical memory that seems to be exceptional. So their ability to just do well on regular memory tests is no different than you and I. Visual reproduction, something called paired associates, digit span, all of those things seem to be the same as control participants, but it's really their autobiographical memory that seems to be exceptional. And one of the interesting things we found about those individuals is that almost all of them also have some obsessional tendencies, which is really interesting. It's not so much that they all have diagnosable obsessive compulsive disorder, but they do have some obsessional tendencies, almost as a personality trait, and we're still diving deep and trying to understand what that truly means. In terms of brain, we're still working on it. We are still doing brain imaging with them, trying to understand what is different, what has changed, and we're trying to recruit a sufficiently large number of individuals that we can start to make sense of it. So that, to me, is one of the most exciting things that's happening right now, because keep in mind, we talked a lot about how memory is fallible, and now these individuals force us to reconsider the evolutionary ideas a little bit more. What about those individuals? Are they not evolutionarily adept? Are they not adaptive? Is there something wrong with their brain? Is there something right about their brain? Are they the next stage in our evolution? We're just seeing early evidence of it. Are they the new X-Men? We have no idea. So that's sort of where we are now. So to summarize, so I know we're out of time here, our take-home messages from today: memory is who we are. I hope I've convinced you that everything that we are is really about our memories. Perception is a gateway to memory, but not everything we perceive is remembered. And we've seen lots of cases where memory can fail. There are multiple memory systems in the brain. We talked about two of them in particular, the hippocampus and the frontal lobes. And we talked about why they're important for different facets of memory function. Memory is imperfect and can be subject to illusions and false memories, which is a side effect of an otherwise very adaptive system. Memory can be strengthened by emotion, a process that requires the amygdala, which is also important for fear. And finally, highly superior autobiographical memory is one of those things that might force us to rewrite book chapters in the memory books and reconsider our notions of adaptive memory. So there's still much more to be discovered, much more for us to figure out, and I hope to keep you in tune with what we discover in that arena. Finally, I'll just end on one of my favorite quotes by Albert Einstein: once you stop learning, you start dying. And I think that's one of the wonderful things that Rotary clubs do and these meetings do, is give its members an opportunity to continue learning about all sorts of interesting topics. I hope this was interesting to all of you. And if we do have a few moments, I'm happy to take questions, but thank you all for your attention.
Can you relate the research to Alzheimer's research?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the tasks that I showed you, the two zebras side by side, by the way, is a task that we have been using to look at early deficits in the context of Alzheimer's disease. So your ability to distinguish between those two zebras and tell which one you saw before starts to degrade pretty early in age. In your third decade, it starts to go down. But if you are on the path to Alzheimer's disease, you are disproportionately impaired on that task. So there's a variety of different approaches that we've developed to try to pick up on the earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease, because that's what we believe is going to be the period of time where we must intervene very, very early. Now, my lab has also been involved in quite a bit of work on Alzheimer's disease biomarkers, which is our ability to develop biological indicators of disease, even in the absence of clinical symptoms. Because by the time somebody is experiencing memory loss and presenting with memory loss, it may be a little late in the game to intervene. We want to identify the biological predictors of that 10, 15 years earlier than that experience, so we can prevent the onset of Alzheimer's disease. So much of that work is ongoing right now.
Dr.
What
Yassa,
do you have to
how do dreams affect memory? They can cloud them, they can clarify.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I always joke with people that, you know, I say, I can tell you about sleep, but don't ask me about dreams because I have no idea about dreams. But I will tell you a couple of things that we know. So first of all, I mentioned before that during the time that you sleep at night, you do replay your memories unconsciously. That actually happens during what's called non-REM sleep. So not the period where you're dreaming, the period where you're sleeping very deeply and not dreaming. Your brain is sifting through memories and storing them with higher fidelity, rehearsing them essentially. But the question of what happens during REM sleep, the period of time where you're actually dreaming, there are some suggestions from the literature now that that is also a time where memory is trying to create connections. And every now and then, there are connections that are sort of idiosyncratic and faulty, so to speak, that get wired up and create kind of interesting situations that mix a whole bunch of memories together. But then by the morning time, those synapses are not selected for storage, right? So it's kind of part of the random process of synaptic wiring and rewiring. And as a result of that, you get these experiences. Now, that's a hypothesis. There's some evidence to suggest it, but it's not clear. So I think the jury is still out when it comes to dreams. Studying dreams is very difficult because it's hard to get two people to have the same dream, and it's very difficult to put somebody in an MRI scanner and say, now we got to make you dream, right? We can't stimulate it somehow, so that makes it exceptionally difficult to study.
What do you have to say about these various memory techniques? One, I can't remember the name, but you assign like playing cards to various rooms in a castle.
Yeah, so thank you, Paul. You're talking about the method of loci, and sometimes called the memory palace or the mind palace. These are ancient techniques used by the Greeks and maybe even many before them. But these techniques allow us to use the incredible power of spatial memory. So what Paul is talking about is if you want to memorize a list of things, and memory champions do this with a 52 card deck, they can memorize the exact order of a shuffled deck by going through it just once, because they take every card, assign it to a spatial location in their built-in memory palace, and they use their imagination to create these very strong associations. So I can tell you it's an incredible ability, but no one is born with it. They practice and practice and practice and practice, and they get very, very good at it. There's an excellent book. Let me just make sure that I have the title correct here, by Joshua Foer. And Joshua Foer has written a book called Moonwalking with Einstein. That is a terrific reference on this. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend that you guys have it even for a book club discussion, because he talks about going from someone with very average, even below average memory. And as a journalist, he went and hung out with memory champions for some time. And as a result, he became the US national memory champion by learning their techniques. So